Okay, welcome everyone to this next edition of VMACS. Just a quick reminder of the ground rules. This is also posted in the chat. Everyone's audio and video is going to be muted. Your video will not be turned on at any time, either by you or by us. During the Q&A session at the end, you can raise your hand and we'll have the opportunity to allow you to talk, but you would have to unmute yourself. So we will never unmute your mic without your consent. We ask that you put any questions during the first 60 minutes into the Q&A. We have co-authors here that will answer them, and especially for clarifying questions and substantive questions can be asked at the end. So without further ado, let me hand it off to Stefania Albanese, our moderator for today, who will introduce our speakers.
Okay, so thank you very much. Today we're very happy to have Matthias Döbke presenting a paper with Titan Alon, Jane Olmsted-Ramsey, and Michelle Turtle on This Time It's Different, the role of women's employment in the Great Lockdown. And so Matthias, you can get started.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, so great to see everybody here live from my basement. Thanks to the organizers for having our paper on this program. These are unusual and sometimes quite scary times, but I have to say that for me, the reaction of the academic sector has been quite encouraging, both at the local level, how we moved all teaching and advising online within days, but also all the research that has come up in this just very short period of time. Everybody is working on this, and also the seminar series that allow us to disseminate this work. So having this strong reaction and including this wonderful seminar series here, I think is a very encouraging thing, and we are very grateful to be able to talk about our research here. So this is work with Titan Alon, Jane Olmsted-Ramsey, and Michelle Turtle, who are all here and ready to answer your questions in the chat while I present. So this is a project, an ongoing project on the role of gender in this crisis that we are currently undergoing, what we call the Great Lockdown period during the coronavirus crisis. Now you might ask, why is gender the first thing or one of the first things to consider? Don't we have bigger things to worry about? And if you want to think about gender, why actually focus on the women? Because in fact, if you just think of the medical crisis, it seems to be the case that the impact is higher on men as opposed to women. So we know that COVID is more deadly to men than to women. In New York, about 2/3 of the deaths, for example, were male rather than female. And that is true and that is important, but from the perspective of macroeconomists, I think it's also important to recognize that we have two crises. One is the health crisis, which we know a lot about, but the second one is the economic crisis, the economic downturn that is created by the necessity to lock down large parts of the economy while the pandemic is going on. And thankfully, so far, only a relatively small fraction of the population is getting seriously ill or dies from this pandemic, but almost everybody, almost the entire population, is really severely affected by the economic downturn. And so figuring out what this economic downturn does, what aspects are important is, I think, an important task for us to do. So here we argue that looking at gender, looking at women is actually quite important, because we're going to argue that the Great Lockdown recession has a very large economic impact on women that's very different from what you usually see in economic recessions. We're going to argue in this talk that this matters a lot for welfare. It matters a lot for policy. So what is the best policy response to get through the recovery relatively quickly and without too much damage? And it also is going to matter for more longer-term macroeconomic repercussions. So we're going to lay out a few different mechanisms through which the gender aspect, the impact on women in particular, is really going to make this recession quite different from others that we have seen before. Now, like most work that is currently being done and perhaps presented in this workshop, this is very much an evolving project that has multiple steps and is certainly very far from done. So this particular project has two steps to it so far. The first one is a paper that's already published. It's called The Impact of COVID-19 on Gender Equality, which is the paper that we did about 6 weeks ago, which is an eternity in COVID time. So what this paper did was to assess the likely impact of the crisis in terms of gender and in terms of macro implications of that based on pre-crisis data. So just what we knew from pre-crisis data on employment patterns, on childcare, for example, what can we expect to happen down the road? And this is what we did first. Now, this is some time ago, so now, of course, the crisis is unfolding. We already have a lot of real-time data on what is actually happening. So step 2 of this project is to gather data on the actual impacts as the crisis unfolds in various countries. And here we draw a lot on other projects. There's many economists and other social sciences working on gathering this data, and we are using what other people have done. We also have our own aspect of this, so we are involved a bit on the fringe, but we are involved with the Dutch LISS study, and I will talk a bit about that, what we expect to get from that study also. And the final step is to figure out what these changes we're going to document, what this mean for the macroeconomic situation, for the recession, for the recovery, for what is going to happen to the entire economy. And so the third step is to have a macroeconomic model that has rich household heterogeneity, so we can talk about this impact on gender, on women versus men, and see what it's going to imply. And this is now the title of the talk today. This time is different, the role of women's employment in the great lockdown. Okay, so this is going to be useful for assessing macro implications, for thinking about long-run impacts, and also for thinking about policy options when we think about what can we do during this crisis and the recovery to lower welfare consequences and maybe speed up the recovery. This third step isn't done, it's very much ongoing, but because it's a macro audience here, I want to show you as much as I can about what we have done so far and what the next steps are going to be. Okay, so that's the plan. Now, before I go into what happens right now with the current recession, just as a benchmark, I want to point out what some, maybe not all of you know, which is that regular recessions are actually also having a strong gender dimension. But the gender dimension is that usually men are hit much stronger by recessions. And this is this term "man sessions" is sometimes used to capture that. So here's one illustration of this. This comes from Michelle and my handbook chapter on families in macroeconomics from a few years ago. This picture shows you for the United States the deviation from trend, so deviation from a HP filtered trend in total labor supply, so total hours supplied in the US economy, broken down by gender and by marital status, so single versus married. What you see in this entire picture is that the black lines are a lot more volatile than the red lines, red for women, black for men. So for example, here, the most recent recession, we have by far the largest fluctuation for the unmarried men, but also fairly large fluctuations for the married men. In comparison, the labor supply of the married women is much more stable. Okay? So it seems to be that recessions have a much bigger impact, usually on men compared to women. A different way of breaking this down, so this is a table also from our handbook chapter, is to look at how you can decompose the overall volatility of labor supply. So this table shows you the total volatility of US labor supply. Volatility here just means percentage standard deviation from in labor supply. And we look both at the total and what we call the cyclical volatility, which is the part of overall volatility that correlates with the business cycle. So that is cyclical as opposed to some other source of fluctuation. Then you can break down how much of this variation comes from male versus female labor supply and also single versus married. So here's that first breakdown. These numbers tell you how much women in this 89 to 2014 period contribute to overall labor supply. It's about 43% of overall hours in the economy, and how much they contribute to volatility. And you see that even though women have more than 40% of the labor supply, they only contribute about 24% to the volatility. And if you break this down further by marital status, you see that this gap between hours and volatility contributions is particularly large for married women. So married women are now a bit over a quarter of total labor supply, but only about 10% contribution to volatility. And so much of the volatility comes from men, not from women. Now, the fact that the cyclical volatility for married women is so low may at first sight seem surprising, because we know that at the micro level, there's nothing more volatile in labor supply than that of married women. Now, you know that the labor supply of married men is in fact fairly stable. You know, they get unemployed sometimes, but they don't really voluntarily vary the labor supply a lot. And so if you do micro elasticities of labor supply, they're much higher for women, in particular married women, than for men. Okay, but at the macro level, you get the opposite, that you get less volatility for women. What this is suggestive of, and there's now a lot of literature on this, is that married women, in fact, play a role as you might say, a shock absorber in a crisis. And that you're going to have many couples where men are maybe unemployed or have lower hours than before, lower earnings. And so at least a fraction of married women compensate by working more, maybe entering for the first time, essentially increasing their attachment to the labor force. So even though it's volatile, it's in fact counter-cyclical to some extent, plays an insurance role, and that is an important feature of usual business cycles. Okay, so that's a little overview of what we know from existing economic recessions, that they are mostly about fluctuations in male labor supply, and women, in fact, to some extent, play an insurance role. Now, we have a recession right now. We have the big lockdown recession, and as the title of the project says, this time we argue it's going to be different. And there's really two important reasons why we think it's going to be different. One has to do with sectors. So one reason why men are usually highly affected by economic recessions is that they are concentrated in sectors that are very cyclical. For example, construction and manufacturing are cyclical sectors, and you have many men working in those sectors. Turns out, if you look at the cyclical breakdown of the current recession, it is not really tilted towards those sectors. Instead, sectors that are affected are things like restaurants and hospitality, sectors that are actually very high in female employment. So just in terms of the sectors that are affected by the shutdown compared to a usual recession, you would expect, and you see by now in the data, that women are much more affected than in a usual recession. There's a second reason for asymmetric impact by gender, which has to do with another aspect of this crisis, which is completely different, which doesn't exist in a regular recession, which is the increase in childcare needs. So one thing that's happening is that childcare centers and schools have closed, so the need for providing childcare at home has massively increased. In fact, it's increased even more than just because of school closures, because with social distancing, even grandparents or neighbors or nannies are a lot less available than usual. So somebody has to take care of all these kids that interferes with work, and we argue this is going to be a bigger impact on women as opposed to men. Of course, there's fathers too. Fathers do more also, but women bear the majority of the burden of childcare today, and that's likely to be also true within the crisis. So for these reasons, it's going to be a bigger impact, and that will have repercussions for what this crisis looks like. So we're going to document those facts, first the initial predictions and then the actual facts. And we're going to argue that this actually matters quite a bit for what this crisis will be like. It matters, first of all, very directly for welfare. If you want to understand which groups are the most affected, it's quite obvious that single parents is going to be a group that is highly affected because their ability to work and provide childcare is very much impaired. And of course, there's many more single moms and single dads. So that's already a first impact of gender. But there's also macro dimensions of this, and one is amplification. So we have now in macro for the last few years done tons of work on the transmission from income to consumption. MPC is now the element that every paper must have. And as I've argued just a couple of slides ago, in a regular recession, there is an important element of shock absorption in the family, because you have a bit of compensation in reduction of male labor supply by increasing, or at least smaller decreases in female labor supply. We're going to argue that the shock absorber is absent this time because it's much more symmetric, maybe even more affecting women, and that will have impacts on amplification, kind of how strong demand will drop as people lose employment and lose income. So these are impacts pretty much during the crisis, pretty much right now. But we're also going to then think about the future, what is going to happen down the road. And one thing you may worry about there is the gender gap. Now we know from existing literature on other economic recessions that employment losses, in particular in recessions, can have quite persistent impacts on earnings, because there's returns to experience, because there's job ladders that can be difficult to get back on. And now that you have a crisis where women are perhaps more affected than men, you're likely to see that the gender gap will respond in a different way. Now, there's some evidence that after the financial crisis, the gender gap actually narrowed, because men were so much more affected. We are likely to see the opposite pattern in the current recession. And finally, we're going to think of even longer term implications, we're going to think about what happens to the division of childcare and work in the long term. And this is where this project is perhaps showing a bit of a silver lining to some of these changes. We're going to, in fact, argue that some of the long-term repercussions of this crisis can be beneficial for working women, can make it easier to combine families and careers. And and the starting point for this observation is that if you think about the gender wage gap today, we know again from a lot of recent research that a lot of the gender wage gap has to do with combining families with work. There isn't much of a gender wage gap before women start to have children, but once women have children, their own earnings are affected on average, whereas the fathers don't really get that same hit. And that reflects, among other things, an uneven division of childcare, the fact that even if you have two full-time working parents, the moms usually do more of the childcare than the men do. That has to do to some extent with social norms, has also to do with work organization, kind of how flexible are jobs. Is it possible to combine your occupation with taking care of children? And we're going to argue that this crisis is likely to make these things easier down the road. To some extent, just because the flexibility in work that is now being expanded is likely to stay. Now everybody learns how to use Zoom for calls, not just academics, but everybody who has an office job. Businesses are going to understand that this saves money on rent for the office. So we expect that a lot of this will stay, will make it easier for everybody to combine children with careers. But given that women now suffer more from the tension between those things, we think they're more likely to be the prime beneficiaries. And then there's also the issue of social norms. So social norms can change if there's big social changes. One change we see now is that there's a huge increase in requirements for childcare. Lots of men, not just women, now have to do much more childcare than usual. In fact, we're going to have millions of families where for the first time, men will be the primary provider of childcare. Maybe because the wife is working in the hospital in an essential job as a doctor, and the husband is an academic or an office worker who is at home and therefore has to take over the childcare. And we argue this is bound to have repercussions also for social norms, and will likely make it easier to combine careers and having children having families in the future, benefiting women, on average more than men, because they're more exposed to these issues today. So that is what we want to do. Okay, so here's the outline of what I want to talk about. So first, some facts from pre-crisis data, essentially a short summary of this paper we wrote some weeks ago, what our predictions were. Then moving on to actual impact. So what have you learned in the last 4 to 6 weeks on what has really happened? Step 3, the macro model. So I will show you the kind of structure we think is going to be useful for understanding the impacts for answering these questions that we have laid out. It's a macro model with heterogeneity by gender, marital status, occupation, and childcare needs, and some other features. And then finally, we're going to talk about, based on this model, what are the short run, medium run, and long run implications of this current crisis and the gendered aspect of this crisis. Now, this last part is very preliminary. I actually won't show you much about that, but I'll give you a bit of a preview of what we plan to do and what we expect to find there. Okay, step 1, facts from pre-crisis data. So this is now our published paper. So this is essentially trying to use existing data to forecast what should we expect to happen during the crisis. So what we did primarily was to use data from the CPS and from the American Time Use Survey to gather data on distribution of women and men by sector, by ability to telecommute, for example, by occupation, and also by division of time in terms of childcare. Who takes care of the children, kind of to make predictions of who will be affected by the rise in the need of childcare. First thing we did there is to look at this dimension of sector. So we expected that the sectors that would be most affected by the downturn are the ones that are not critical. If you work in the hospital or in a grocery store, you will keep on working. If you are non-critical, you're more likely to not be able to work. And then it also depends on your ability to work from home. If you have a job where you can telecommute like we do, then you can thankfully keep on working in your basement, but many people don't have those jobs. And so if you want to look at the impact of gender, first question you want to ask, how do women and men divide in terms of employment in critical sectors and telecommutable jobs? So in terms of critical sectors, our rough assessment said that men have somewhat more critical jobs than women do. telecommuting, so there we use an element from the American Time Use Survey that a couple of years ago asked people, in your occupation, is it possible to telecommute, and do you actually telecommute? And based on that, we formed some thresholds to divide occupations into more and less telecommutable. And so here we found that men actually have somewhat more, a higher share of employment in jobs where you can telecommute compared to women. So by both of these dimensions, what we found is that the impact on women, just in terms of occupation and sector, is actually going to be likely to be somewhat higher. Now, I should say, depending on how you put thresholds, how you break this down, you can get somewhat different answers. So you can also choose different thresholds and get this to be about the same across women and men. What you don't really get is that men are much more affected. Now, so even if it was the same, keep in mind it's very different from the usual recessions where men are much more affected, say because construction and manufacturing goes down so far. Okay, so this is the aspect of sector. Next, the aspect of childcare. For predicting who will do childcare during the crisis, well, it makes sense to look who did childcare before the crisis took place. And not surprisingly, it is for the most part women. Now, most extremely, that's the case when you think of single parents. There's about 15 million single moms in there. There's also single dads, but just not that many. So this table gives you a breakdown of the living arrangements of children under 18 in the United States. So about 16 million live with the mom only, but only about 3 million live with the dad only. So if you think of the most affected people, the single parents, it's going to be mothers a lot more than fathers. Moving on to couples, so if you have families where two parents raise children together, there you're also going to have some inequality in the impact on childcare because of the pre-existing work arrangement. So this table breaks down the distribution of married couples. This is all from census data, by the way. So married couples with children in the United States by employment status. And so we're looking at the husband and the wives, and we're breaking them down by not employed, part-time, and full-time work. And what you see right away is that for husbands with children, the vast majority of them are full-time employed. Okay, so it's fairly unusual. So not that many are unemployed, or actually almost none are part-time employed. Full-time employment is really the norm for married fathers. Whereas for the married mothers, you see a fairly large fraction either not employed or employed part-time. Okay, so this is probably just about a half of the married mothers are either part-time or not employed, so they're full-time homemakers. And then, by default, you would expect that they would then bear the majority of childcare also during the crisis. Now, the potential for really sharing of responsibility is probably the highest among the 44% of couples of married couples with children where both parents are employed full-time. But if you look at those couples, even there, you see that the breakdown isn't even. Okay, so this table now looks at those 44% of married couples with children in the United States and who both work full-time. So conditional on full-time work. And here we break down the weekly hours of childcare on average among these couples by gender. This is American Time Use Survey data. And so you see that even though they both work full-time, women do a lot more than men. So it's about 10 versus 7 hours on average. If you look at couples with at least one child under the age of 5, which is where the childcare needs are higher, it's an even bigger gap, both absolute and percentage-wise. So it's about 17 versus 10.5 hours difference. Okay. And so you have this large gap. Expectations would be that you would see most of this gap also during the crisis, because there's some reason why there's uneven childcare before the crisis. Maybe because the husband earns more, maybe because of the social norm that somehow either the father or the mother or both believe that it's just the right thing. It's better for kids to be taken care of by the mother. Whatever the reason, there's really no expectation this reason would go away as you go into this crisis. And that would then suggest that you would see this breakdown also during the crisis, that women would be much more affected. Okay, so far, what I've done is just show you some pre-existing data that suggests that both in terms of sector and occupation of employment and in terms of childcare requirements, that women are likely to see the bigger impact of the lockdown recession. I want to talk a little bit about the aspect of job flexibility, because one thing that is going to play an important role is whether you can work from home if you have flexible employment. This is particularly important if you want to think about the long-run implications, because we do expect that some of this flexibility in working from home, for example, will stay with many employers. And so you're going to want to know, well, what is that going to do to the allocation of childcare and therefore the ability to combine having a career with having a family. Now you can actually see that in the data too, because of this telecommuting survey that was done with the American Time Use Survey. And there you see that, first of all, having a telecommuting job is very predictive of involvement in childcare. And in fact, it's also predictive of more gender equality. So if you look at married men from the previous group we just looked at, and you look at married men who are married to women who cannot telecommute. So the wife has a job where she has to go somewhere to the factory, to the office. She can't be at home. Whereas the man has a job, some other kind of job. Then you see that among the men married to these women, the ones who can telecommute do about 50% more childcare compared to the men who don't. So much higher involvement of childcare in the men who have flexibility in their own employment, and therefore also much more balanced distribution of childcare among those couples. Okay, so that is suggestive that work organization is really quite an important element of the ability to combine careers and families, of the ability to have a balance, between mothers and fathers' involvement in childcare. And so if you have more of this, that is one basis to expect some change in the medium and long term for the division of labor in the family. Final thing I want to talk about is the potential for changing social norms. So, we know from a number of papers that even small changes in the distribution of childcare can have long-term implications. For example, there's a number of papers on the impact of paternity leave policies. We mentioned here one from Spain, Libertad Gonzalez and Ferrer, where they look at a reform where they introduced just 2 weeks of leave for fathers. You have a baby, you go home for 2 weeks, take care of the baby, then you go back to work. 2 weeks isn't much, it's a small fraction of the lifetime of a baby, but even though it's small, so the paper shows that this small change had a quite substantial long-term impact on the distribution of childcare among couples affected. So those couples that were at the beginning of this reform taking more leave for the father have a more even distribution of childcare years later. And that's a small change. What we have right now is orders of magnitude bigger, both in duration, but also in terms of how much childcare everybody all of a sudden has to do. So just extrapolating from studies like that, you would expect a bigger change. There's also many studies that show that social norms and beliefs are important for female labor supply and for ultimately distribution of childcare. So I'm mentioning a few studies here. All of these show that shocks, World War II is another good example, can have a very persistent impacts on how people divide work and family responsibilities through changing social norms and through changing beliefs. And again, we think this is maybe the biggest shock we have seen in this dimension since World War II. We are expecting large changes there. In particular, one reason to think that is that even though, as we just argued, the majority of the burden of childcare will, again fall on women during the crisis, there will be a significant fraction of the population where you are going to have men in control of children, and those are the ones where the women are in an essential job. They have to go somewhere else to work, but the men are able to take over at home. And so again, based on the pre-existing data on the fractions of women and men in essential versus inessential and commutable versus non-telecommutable occupations, we estimate that between 9 and 12% of married couples, you're going to see that the father will be the primary provider of childcare during this crisis. Okay, and it's a big change. That is millions of men who now kind of take over and become full-time dads. And this is a big change which we think is bound to have some impact on social norms. It will be written about and will push, I think, social norms towards a more equitable direction. Now, just to give you one other perspective on this expectation. So I don't know about you guys, but one thing that has never happened to me is that I've gotten a letter or an email from the general public about a paper I've written. I've never gotten a letter where somebody said, listen, I saw your paper about the representative consumer doing his or her decisions in this model, and the way that Euler equation for consumption and savings works, that's exactly how my wife and I decide on retirement savings at night. Has never happened. However, it has happened in this current project. So here's an email that I got a few days ago. This is a person I don't know emailing us about our project. And she is saying that she was, first of all, excited to see the paper, and that her husband is a dentist who never did much of anything at home. But now during the crisis, because she has to work and he as a dentist is currently not working, so he has transformed into a stay-at-home dad for the past 5 weeks. And she says this effect on our family has been profound and life-changing, and it would never have happened without the global pandemic. Her emphasis, the caps, that's what she wrote. And this is just one person, but I think you're going to have millions of people in the situation where they really have a complete change of the previous normal. And those are the things that that can displace social norms, that can give you long-run change. Okay, so this everything I told you so far was pre-crisis stuff. Now, in retrospect, maybe it was a bit risky to make these predictions, because you know that a smart person should never make predictions, in particular predictions that will be verified in their lifetimes. And we did predictions for just a few weeks down the road. But as it turns out, much of what has happened so far does confirm these, maybe not very difficult to make predictions, of a large impact on women. So there's, we have some of our own work, but there's a lot of other papers, and so I will just cite a few figures from things that have come along recently, what has happened so far. So the first thing I'm showing you is from this study by Alexander Bick and Adam Blandon. So these guys are essentially running an online survey that is supposed to give you a higher frequency version of the CPS during the crisis. So they try to get the same information and then see how the crisis affects employment, for example, of various groups. So here you see their results. So March is the actual CPS, and then the next two bars are their survey. So here you see the employment rate for men on the left and women on the right from March 8 until April 12, so into the beginning of the crisis, into the beginning of the lockdown. And so you see massive employment losses, but you see larger employment losses, both absolute and percentage-wise for women. So far in the US, it seems very much true that women are actually not just hit the same, which would already be very different, but are hit harder in terms of employment or unemployment by the crisis. Another thing you see is that in terms of hours, conditional and working, not that much has changed. So this is suggestive that this crisis is really mostly about the extensive margin of not being able to work at all, which has some implications for how you want to model that. Okay, so large impact on the employment of women. You can also break this down by states. There's some journalists who have been looking at the state level unemployment data. Of course, much more will be known in just a few weeks, but what these guys have found is that in every state, in fact, women have filed the majority of unemployment claims so far, once these schools and workplaces were closed. And so the female share in unemployment claims in this data was from 53% in Wyoming to 67% in Alabama, so a vast majority of these claims. You can also look at international evidence. So another interesting research being done is by Adams, Prassel, Boneva, Golan, and Rao, who are running another real-time survey, but across countries. So they have a version for the UK, the US, and Germany. So for the US, they get the same result. Women lose more jobs. The UK looks very much like the US, so also larger employment losses. Interesting observation is that in Germany, it's actually not the case. So in Germany, it's about the same employment losses for men versus women. Again, I want to keep emphasizing the same is still very different from normal, because normal is men lose much more, but it's certainly different between Germany and the US and the UK. One thing that does suggest is that labor market institutions actually do matter a lot. And one thing we know is that Germany has this Kurzarbeit scheme, where the government essentially pays firms not to fire workers. And so you go down to half time or 0 hours, and the government pays most of the loss in income during this time, but you don't formally lay anybody off, which the most recent crisis suggests is actually quite useful for getting employment to bounce back quickly, once the immediate crisis is over. And you do see it showing up in that data. Another thing you can see from this 3-country survey is the impact on childcare. So here is in this survey the amount of childcare being done by men and women in these 3 countries. And you see it's high. So this is daily hours of childcare. If you add up these daily hours of childcare, you see it's an order of magnitude larger than normal. So this reflects that now you have all these children at home, somebody has to take care of them. And you also see that the gender gap is still there. So certainly the red lines, which are women, are higher than the blue lines, which are men. So women do the majority of this work. But you do see that compared to normal, the ratios are not as large as usual. In particular for homeschooling, it is now a lot more even. And if you look at the total work that men do, it is really a different order of magnitude compared to normal. So here you have close to 5 hours total of childcare plus homeschooling per day for these men who are working from home, times 5 days of the week. During the week is already 25 hours by Friday plus the weekend. So these guys are doing way more than they would have done before the crisis. And so it's really, I think, quite a significant sea change in what men contribute here. Again, we think it's going to have long-term repercussions, not just during, but also beyond the crisis. Another way of looking at that is to ask, well, how many men are actually now the primary provider of childcare? So there's a study from Germany, the Mannheimer Corona studio that does that. So here's a breakdown in the first 2 weeks of school closures into couples where the wife, the husband, or both parents are providers of childcare. And you do see that there is a quite significant fraction of families where the men are now the primary provider of childcare. Okay, of course, again, it's always going to be less than the women, but it's quite a lot, especially compared to normal, where there's very few of families where men are primary providers of childcare. Another thing we just saw yesterday come out is a survey of millennial moms. I don't know why just millennial, but this is what they asked. So they asked mothers of the millennial generation, and they asked these mothers whether they're sharing their childcare duties equally with their partner, whoever the father of their child might be. And so in that survey, they found a 12 percentage point increase in the share of moms who report that their partner carries equal weight. So it's I forgot the level, but it's probably close to doubling of that share. So it's a very large increase in the number of men who really play an important role for childcare. Okay, last thing I want to show you from the current evidence side is the Dutch data. And this is the study that we are also involved in ourselves. So the LISS data in the Netherlands is essentially the Dutch version of the PSID. What's nice about it is it's monthly, so you have high frequency stuff, and it's fairly easy to add new surveys, new modules to that survey. And so Michelle is connected to a group that allows us to be connected to the data and to ask questions about employment, about childcare, about working from home. So all these aspects that are important to us, and you can link it to the whole data set so you can know everything previously also about those people. So it's very rich data. I think it will be very useful for ultimately really pinning down a lot of, say, the modeling that we want to do. And so in this data set too, from the results so far, you see that women's hours drop more than men by 17% versus 10% by men. And you also see a bit of a shift in childcare responsibility. So you see that, first of all, people are now much more likely to work at home. So this part over here is working from home, has gone up for everybody. And for men, now working from home is in fact very much predicted by having children. And so now the childcare responsibilities do determine what men do, which wasn't the case before the crisis. Before the crisis, some men worked from home, but it had nothing to do with childcare. And you can also see here this role of essential occupations. So you see that if you look at people in essential occupations, that the gender gap in childcare is essentially gone. So among workers who have important jobs, it's very much symmetric for women and men. It's very asymmetric for non-essential jobs. You find that in about 30% of couples where only the mother is in a critical occupation, the father is now the sole provider of childcare. Okay, so again, confirming this intuition that you're going to have many couples, orders of magnitude more than usual, that are going to be in the situation of having a father as the main provider of childcare. Okay, so that is the evidence to date. There's in fact a lot more. I think many of you have seen these studies coming out, but what we have seen so far does confirm what we expected, that the impact on women is very large, very much larger compared to usual recession. In fact, in most places we've looked at so far, larger than for men, which is really the opposite of the usual pattern. And we've also seen this large rise in childcare, with at least a fraction of men now becoming primary providers of childcare. Next thing we want to do is to use a macroeconomic model to figure out what are the implications of these changes going to be. Okay. And here we build on a large existing literature, and I just want to mention a few key papers. So first of all, this is a paper about the role of female labor supply in business cycles, which is a pretty new but very active research area. So Stefania's paper is perhaps the most comprehensive study of this, and one of the first also to look at different aspects of changing female labor supply on business cycles. For example, the role of female labor supply for jobless recoveries and the Great Moderation. There's also work with Shaheen on the gender unemployment gap, which has to do with the sectoral distribution of employment. A few other papers, our own handbook chapter also talks about this stuff. I'm mentioning Bardocci here. You don't know who that is. He's a grad student at Northwestern who works on a Hank model, which has a gender aspect in there, and argues that if you want to understand NPCs and impact of shocks on consumption, looking at insurance in the family is actually quite important. Great student. Look at him in the fall. So this is one literature. A different one, quite related, is one on family risk sharing. So the extent to which families are able to absorb risk because of joint labor supply. And so Blundell, Pistafari, and Supporter Excellence, an important study on this. A job market paper by a student from Indiana, Catherine Elleroth, did this in a search setting, so which is quite related to our model. There's earlier work on joint search in the labor market. So a few other studies that we built on here. And then finally, there is now, I guess, 100 studies on the macro studies of the great lockdown recession so far. I'm mentioning only one because this is one that focused on search. And ours is also going to be focused on the extensive margin with unemployed and employed people. But of course, there's many other recent references too. Okay, so here's the ingredients we want to put into our model. We want to have, of course, women and men, also marital status, singles and couples, and we want to have childcare needs. We're going to focus on labor supply on the extensive margin. And that's what the data suggests, that you either lose a job or don't. But we will have part-time work, because part-time work is quite important to understand the whole distribution of family responsibilities, also quite prevalent in the data. We're going to have occupations just by whether or not you are able to work from home. That's important during the crisis. And then it's going to be a search setting with job destruction shocks and unemployment. And then for the long-term implications, we're going to have accumulation of experience. So if you're unemployed, you're going to lose productivity in the long term potentially. And finally, we also want to think of these very long-run implications for the division of labor in the household. So for that, we're going to have a social norm that shapes the division of labor, and we're going to allow the social norm to respond to what happens in the macroeconomy. Now, what we don't have, by the way, is an infection model. Now, everybody has one of these SIR models of infections. We don't. We're really just going to focus on the economic crisis. So we're going to represent the great lockdown simply as a shock to the labor market and childcare needs. So the impact of the lockdown, we're not going to look at the underlying epidemiology of how you got there. Many people do that. In fact, Michelle has one of those papers too, but this project doesn't. So here is the setting. So we have three types of households: single women, single men, and couples. These types are going to be permanent for now. They have a bunch of state variables they carry around. So they have assets, just like the usual savings, human capital age for each person. So that's how productive you are. Kids, do you have any? So zero would be none. And then you have small or large kids. So this is just a simple way to characterize that childcare needs a lot higher when you have young children. Then you have employment, could be either employed or unemployed. Occupation, either you can telecommute or not. And there's a social norm, which could be modern or traditional. Okay, and you'll see how this is going to affect the decision problem in just a second. Now, how do state variables evolve? So we have children arriving and leaving in exogenous fashion. So there's some transition probability to have kids K prime tomorrow, given kids K today. And they depend on gender. So pi G is the arrival rate for a single of gender G. Little pi is for singles, big pi is for couples. So generally, lowercase is singles, uppercase is couples. And so this is the same thing for couples. Are they likely to get kids, or maybe they move out and you go back to zero? Employment opportunities are also transition probability. So you have laws of motion of having a certain employment tomorrow, so a job offer, or being unemployed, depending on your current employment status, and also potentially depending on the number of kids and on gender, because we know that having kids and say being a single mom, does have some implications for the labor market, for example. So you can get job offers, you can reject them. So often, it will be the case that somebody has a possibility of working, but because during the crisis they have so much childcare, they can't take the offer, they have to decline and therefore stay home to take care of the kids. Human capital is a ladder of human capital, and you go up and down according to labor supply. So if you work more, you go up. If you don't work, you go down. And then the transition for the social norm is going to depend on the macro division of childcare responsibilities in the economy. So intuitively speaking, if you see many families where men do all the work of childcare, you say, well, maybe that's fine. Maybe it doesn't hurt the kids. Maybe this is something that we actually should not be concerned about. Okay, so here is what the decision problem looks like for an unemployed single. So an unemployed single comes with a gender, and U means unemployed. State variables are assets A, human capital H, and kids K. And you maximize your current utility from consumption and leisure, and then utility from tomorrow on. And your constraints, there's a budget constraint that says that your consumption plus savings equals your unemployment insurance plus return on savings. This gamma of K is the childcare requirement. How many hours do you need to take care of your kid? This thing is going to be shocked in the crisis. It's larger for small kids than for big kids. It's 0 for no kids. And then your time constraint is just leisure plus childcare requirement equals to your time endowment. Okay, so that's all you have to do. If you look at employed single, it looks similar, just a tiny bit more complicated. So now you're employed. A new state variable is occupation here. Are you in a job that you can telecommute or not? In the constraint, you now have your gender-specific wage, your human capital, your labor supply. Labor supply is discrete, could be part-time or full-time. Still the same childcare requirement, and now a somewhat more complicated time constraint. Okay, so let me talk about the time constraint. You see this VMACS operator over here. What does it do? What this captures is that if you have a job where you can telecommute, it's easier to take care of the kids. And the way we model that is that if you have the job where you can telecommute, you can use a fraction of your time that you work also to take care of children. Now, while I sit here and give a lecture, in principle, I could have one of my sons watching TV in the background. Thankfully, they're not here right now, but I could do that. I wouldn't be able to do that if I had to go to the factory. So here you have the indicator variable. Occupation is telecommute. Then this thing is turned on. And then fraction phi, depends on the size of the kids, of my labor supply N is going to be free childcare. And so the effective childcare that enters into my constraint is total childcare T, the thing over here, minus that. Okay, so essentially it's a bit getting free time for childcare reduces the time I have to use on top of that to take care of the kids. Okay, so those are our singles. And then that is, so these two value functions were after you've already decided whether you want to work or not. At the beginning of the period, if you have a job offer, you have to decide whether you want to take it or not. So W as opposed to V is the beginning of period value function, which is the maximum if you have an offer of being employed or unemployed. And as I said, in the crisis with high childcare needs, if you're a single parent with a job that can't telecommute, well, maybe you're just not able in terms of time to do both. So then you have to decide here to go into unemployment. If you have no job offer, it's simple, but then you're going to be unemployed. Okay, so for our dual earner couples, things will look similar, just two of everything. So here's the decision problem for a dual earner couple. So EE means both are employed. HF, HM, tracking the human capital of both, tracking the occupation of both. What we maximize here is the weighted welfare, so weighted average of these two spouses. You can think of this as a collective model of the family, cooperative decision making with some bargaining weights, lambda and 1 minus lambda. So we have individual utility from consumption and leisure, here for the woman, here for the man. We have future utility, everything evolves, state variables evolve. And then here we have the social norm. So this M times phi times TM minus TF is the impact of the social norm. What this says is that if you are the traditional type, so if your norm is turned on, then you're going to have some utility cost whenever the husband does more childcare than the wife. So TM is the childcare time of the father, don't have to be married, could be cohabitating. TF is the childcare time of the mother. If this is positive, then you get a decrease in utility. If it's negative, you get an increase. Okay, this is just saying that for some reason this couple thinks it's not good for utility if the husband does a lot of childcare. Could be just you know, a norm of what's right. Maybe it's some belief about what's good for the children, but this is what it is. And then the constraints, budget constraints are just the two constraints summed together. The childcare constraint is the two constraints summed together. So now you can have female and male childcare, and then this aspect of saving time, if you are able to telecommute, if you're able to work from home, is not showing up for both of these spouses. Okay, so that is the decision problem. There's value functions also if you have only one earner or both are unemployed. They are parallel, so I won't show those to you here. If you have job offers, then you have to decide, do we want to take both jobs, just one job, or should we both go into unemployment? Okay, and this thing is actually going to be quite affected by the shock. If you move up the childcare requirements, you're going to have many more couples who decide to have a more extreme division of labor during the crisis. Okay, so that is what the decision problems look like. I mentioned this, but just to reiterate how human capital and social norms evolve. So human capital is a function of labor supply. So you move up if you work, and you move down if you don't. And so this gives you a skill loss but not employed. And this means that if you drop out, like many women do now, that you're going to have impacts on your future earnings. So this is kind of the main channel for the gender earnings gap in this model. You also have then a transition for the social norm, and we're making this dependent on the total fraction of couples where the man is a primary childcare provider. So it's not internal, it's not a function of your own labor supply. You just look around the neighborhood, and if all of a sudden you see a bunch of dads pushing down the stroller on the street, you think, well, maybe this is the right way of doing it. Maybe I should give up this old norm. So it evolves, but it evolves as a function of aggregate states, kind of similar to some of these learning models about female labor supply that we mentioned on the literature slide. Okay, so that is the framework, and the idea is to calibrate this framework to match a bunch of facts about the US structure of labor supply, childcare, and business cycles before the crisis, and then throw crisis into here. And so what we match, to some extent we've done it, but not in every detail, is to match labor market flows by marital status, gender, and kids, match distribution of the full-time of the couples among combinations of full-time work, part-time work, and no work. So that table I've already shown you earlier in the data. Pin down the accumulation of human capital based on estimated returns to experience and skill loss from unemployment, and then also the impact of being able to telecommute on the time allocation. So even in this pre-crisis data, we do see a very clear impact of telecommuting on the allocation of childcare time. This is something that allows us to calibrate that aspect of the model. Okay, so that is the structure that we have. The plan is to take this structure to the data and to use it to work out what are the short, medium, and long-run implications of this current crisis. Now, this isn't done, so it's more of a preview I want to give you of what we're going to do next. But we have some initial pictures, but I think you're going to get a pretty good idea of what this framework will deliver. So what we're going to do is to put recessions into this model. And the main question is going to be a comparison of regular recessions compared to the great lockdown recession that we're going through right now. So the regular recession, think of 2008 or any earlier recession, is primarily a big change in man's job destruction and job finding rate. Okay, so it goes down a lot, essentially based on their initial occupational distribution. It's going to be a smaller shock for the women, again based on the sectors that they are employed in at that time. You could use Stefania and Shine's work on the gender unemployment gap to pin down the regular recession. Then we're going to compare that to the great lockdown recession that we're going to right now. It's also a large change in men's job destruction and job finding rates. Men are losing tons of jobs, but it's going to be an equally large change for women. So we're going to make it symmetric on the sectoral impact. then we're going to add more to that. So we're going to add the rise in childcare needs. We're going to scale up how much you have to be home to take care of the kids because the schools and the daycare centers are closed. And we're also going to put in there a shift in telecommuting ability and ultimately endogenously in social norms. So the telecommuting ability to some extent is a shock because businesses change how work works right now. Social norms is going to evolve as a endogenous outcome inside the model. And the questions we want to answer then, by doing these comparisons is the following list. First thing we want to do is look at welfare. So we want to ask, well, how are these different households affected? Are there particular households that are in particularly high need of help right now? And single parents, of course, come to mind there. Second question is the kind of typical macro business cycle question. Are we going to get amplification out of this shock? Are we going to get an even deeper crisis because of some kind of contagion compared to regular recession? And there's already some work on this being done from different perspectives. So think of I think it was the first talk in the series, Werning, Lorenzoni, Guerreri, and who else was there? I'm forgetting one more. Ludwig Straub. So there was one mechanism why you would get amplification of this crisis. We're going to argue that a different mechanism for this is the loss of intra-household insurance. That in a regular recession you have families working as shock absorbers because some wives are able to compensate for the employment loss of their husbands. This is going to be much less possible right now because of the large impact on women and men, and so really the symmetry of the shock. And so we want to quantify how much bigger is the transmission from income to consumption because of this lack of intra-household insurance. So this is what happens during the crisis. Then we move on to policies. You can ask, well, what do different policy measures do for maybe making the recovery faster or less painful? One thing, for example, you can think about is if you were able to open schools earlier as opposed to other occupations, because that really eases the childcare requirement. How much of a faster recovery and a different shape of recovery would you get out of that? And then we can move on to the medium and the long term. So for the medium term, there's the gender gap. So we can quantify the impact on the gender gap through employment losses by gender, compared with empirical returns to experience. And finally, the long run implications, a bit more speculative, but I think ultimately quite important, on the division of labor because of evolving social norms, also because of evolving work. If you have more telecommuting ability throughout, that is going to have an impact on childcare and therefore also on work in the period after the recession, after the recovery is completed. Okay, this is completely ongoing work, so I won't really argue that we have answered these questions. I will show you some pictures. You will see that very wisely we have not put any numbers on either axis of these graphs because the numbers are still not final. So we have a rough calibration to match roughly these pre-crisis states, and we have thrown the crisis into the model. But this is really just an illustration for what we're trying to get as opposed to a final result. So here you see the impact on the ratio of women's to men's labor supply, and you see that in a regular recession in the model now, this goes up. Women work more because men lose more jobs. For example, in the Great Recession over the first year, when you look at if you look at only married people, the employment losses for married men were 8 times as large as for married women. So it implies a large change in the ratio of employment. In our model, in the COVID-19 recession, it's the other way around. So in fact, you get a decline in male to female to male labor supply. And keep in mind, the shock is symmetric. The shock on employment is symmetric. So the number of women and men who just lose jobs exogenously is the same. So this difference really comes from the childcare aspect, and that you have more childcare, and the model then kind of, because of distribution of household types and of pre-existing allocations, makes women do more of this extra work, hitting them harder. You can see the impact of children here. For example, we look at singles with and without children. You see that usually blue, you get a fairly similar response in employment for singles with and without children. It's not the same because the gender composition is different, but it's similar. In the crisis, it is totally different. So much bigger impact on singles with children compared to without. No, again, this point that single parents will be very highly affected. Final picture, gender wage gap. Now, this is what we found so far. In a regular recession, the model predicts actually a narrowing of the gender gap. So this is the female to male wage ratio goes higher female wages after a regular recession. There's some evidence this actually happened after the recent great financial crisis recession. Whereas in the COVID-19 recession, this gap becomes larger. Okay, so a widening of the gender gap, again, quite different from a usual downturn. So with that, I'm out of time. So thanks all for being here. I was happy to give you a bit of an overview of this work. Now, there's many things that are totally different about this time compared to normal times. We do think that economically, the impact on women and childcare is perhaps the biggest distinction in economic terms between a regular recession and this recession. And we think this matters tremendously for what you should have done in the short run for policy. It matters a lot for the medium run impact of this crisis in terms of how deep it will be, how you will recover from that. And I think will also matter quite a bit for the long run potential changes in social norms and gender equality. Thank you. I'm sure my co-authors have already answered some questions in the Q&A, but I'll be happy to talk about more here.
Okay, thank you so much, Matthias, for a great presentation. So now we can open up the floor to questions from the audience. Just to remind everyone, if you have a question, please use the raise your hand tab in the participants section, and then we'll call on you as soon as we see your question. And when we call on you, we will give you the opportunity to speak, and then you have to unmute yourself. We can start with questions from the floor. As everybody gets organized and thinks about their question, I'm going to actually start with a question that I had on the sort of long-term cultural impacts of this more equal division of childcare that we're potentially seeing. So you cite evidence from Spain and other episodes where it seems that even a small imposition of greater symmetry in the division of childcare seems to have long-run effects. But on the other hand, the other papers that we have that look at more the theoretical evolution of social norms, including the Fernandez-Foldi-Olivetti paper on the effect of World War II, and then the learning papers that you cite, there it's really a very slow-moving phenomenon, the cultural change. So I was wondering how, because you didn't talk about how you modeled it exactly in the model, so, question sort of to give us more detail on that. But also then, one aspect that affects the asymmetric division of labor is gender wage gap. And in your model, you have this implication that there could be negative repercussions for gender wage gap, and that could partly undo the cultural norm effect. So if you can sort of elaborate on that a little bit, since you went very fast during the talk.
Yes, so maybe I'll start, and Michelle maybe wants to add more in a second. So I would first of all say that it's the social norm part is the one that's a bit more speculative, because I think you're right, there's effects in different directions. Now, if you have a widening of the gender wage gap, that alone could reinforce the division of labor the way it's now, the traditional division of labor in the recovery. And also during the crisis, there's also a lot being written about there perhaps being a reinforcement of the traditional division of labor, and that you're going to have even more couples being in the normal role model. And I think it's certainly possible that you're going to have some effects both ways. I guess our belief is because this observation of so many men now being full-time providers is such a deviation from the previous norm that this is going to kind of win out in that race. But I agree with you, it's not obvious. And so we have to really do more work on quantifying based on other work on what the changes are, what to expect. Now, I should say the second aspect for the long-run changes, there's the aspect of the social norm, but there's also the aspect of the work organization. And the reason I'm overall optimistic is because in addition, you have that, I think on the employer side, you're going to find many of them being more flexible down the road, just because now they have paid the fixed cost and they realize saving money on rent is a good idea. And that's going to be beneficial. And perhaps you might also expect a bit of a change in work culture. So one thing that can hold you back is that you have a workplace where it's just expected to work long hours if you are on the career track. You know, you're a junior in a law firm, you're an assistant professor at Chicago, you know, kind of expected to be there every night until 10 p.m. That makes it very hard. And those are social norms that can, you know, that are multiple equilibria that can be changed, and often it takes a shock for that change to happen. You know, so now you're going to have executives and you know, law firm partners on Skype calls with children running through the room. Everybody becomes aware that even executives have children and childcare needs. And so I think there's also a possibility of that culture being shifted at least some way in the direction of more equality. So there's different aspects. I think at least the work-set aspects are clear-cut which direction they go. Of course, the overall picture is a complicated one, and we have to learn more about it. Maybe Michelle has...
Yes, I just wanted to add that I think ultimately might depend on the country. So as Matthias said, there's these two effects in opposite directions. So there's this the dads that are taking some fraction of that, so doing a lot more childcare now. But there's also a lot of women who are cutting back hours. And I think the starting point matters a lot. So in the United States, we see a lot of moms who are working full-time pre-crisis. And so we see actually a lot of men taking over. In Germany, as a different example, even pre-crisis, most married women are working very little hours, 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week. So those seem to be all cutting back now. And that may actually lead to social norms, you know, that second effect dominating. Remains to be seen, of course.
Okay, thank you. So there is now a question from the floor from Kanya. Kanya, you're permitted to speak. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was just wondering, I have two small comments. One is that whether you had considered having a social norm factor that went the other way, where a household might actually gain utility if the father took on more of this childcare responsibilities. The other one was, I think it's kind of briefly been mentioned in the previous response, but yeah, how sensitive are the results to the initial amount of childcare that is provided by the state? Because if a lot of childcare is provided by the state already, in terms of healthcare, or they're given a lot of benefits for financial transfers for having children in the first place, then the impetus on the household to go out and work in the first place is less. Whereas if you have a system where you don't provide much childcare, like monetarily in the first place, then you're going to see more sensitivity on families with children between a normal recession and the great lockdown recession. That's it. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you for the question. So on the reverse norm, as a possibility, I can certainly imagine that this could happen, that, you know, it becomes, you know, a sign of being progressive and to have a reversal in norms. It's just in the data we see so little of that it seems unlikely to be an important factor right now. So if you look at the time use data, it's quite stunning that even among couples where the woman earns more than the husband, has higher earnings, often you still have that the wife also does more of the childcare and the other housework. And so it's not easy to find couples so far that seem to have evidence of a reversal in the norm. So I think as a possibility, it's definitely, you know, plausible. I don't think in the data we can really see it so far. Michelle, maybe you want to talk about the second part?
Yes, I guess the second question, if I understood correctly, was about the size of the childcare shock. And I totally agree. It does obviously depend on what's being provided pre-crises, and countries or even states in the United States differ a lot by that. So if people pre-crisis, especially if you're talking about younger kids that are not in school, is provided everywhere, obviously. But if we're talking about younger kids need in daycare, if couples weren't using that in the first place pre-COVID, then there isn't really much of a shock to those couples, obviously. So yeah, so to that extent, the heterogeneity pre-crisis will matter for the size of the shock. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kanya. So I want to encourage more questions from the floor. There's no need to be shy, so we are waiting for your questions. But in the meantime, actually, Claudia Sam, one of the panelists, had a question. Claudia?
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to reiterate it's so great to hear everybody's questions. This was such a great paper. So definitely, there were a lot in the Q&A, so you can ask them again, just so we all hear them. So I have two questions, and both are, I think, more in like, I just want to hear your thinking. I don't believe you covered them, and they're more like extensions. So I don't want to like, everything you did is really interesting. And I think it is so important to think about the labor supply and the constraints for men and women separately, and even mention women, like a lot of papers don't. Anyway, so two things. One, you talked about how this recession is different than other recessions. So I agree that the way we came into this is very different, with a public health crisis and a certain degree of like, that we just we shouldn't leave our homes. But as the recession becomes much more severe, I mean, we're really like in a depression now. Like it's just like, it's really bad. So I think at this point it becomes more of a demand shock. And I wanted to understand a little bit more about, when you play this out, like not what's happening right now, when it does become safe to go home, when children can go back to daycares and go back to school, like what does this look like in terms of more like labor force participation? And that follows on to a second question. So in the United States, and actually, well, I mean, anyways, in the United States, a little under 60% of adult women are in the labor force. And one of the things we know from past research is when households have an income shock, a way that they deal with it often is, with the United States, because labor force participation of women has been traditionally less, like a woman will enter the labor force. So I want to think about, since you have this very rich model to think about both sides of the labor force decisions, like what you think a severe recession after people can leave their home, what it does to women's labor force participation going forward, which of course can affect cultural norms. So I don't know, I want you to kind of think, like spin it forward a little bit, and I'm just curious what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. So on the recession, so ours is so far primarily a model of the household side. We don't really have an explicit production side, but I think it's to some extent designed to be able to speak to that. If you think about the recession turning into a demand recession, there's really two ways in which that would happen. I think one way in which it can happen is that behavior continues to be different because of the crisis. So even after we officially close the lockdown, many people, I don't want to be on an airplane right now, not because it's forbidden, but because I'm just afraid it's going to be a dangerous place to be. And you might expect that behavior will be different in terms of demand for restaurants, for travel. So this is really something very much related to the crisis. But the second and more conventional reason why you get kind of amplification on demand is that people change their consumption savings decisions. So that they decide, well, I shouldn't consume, I should save more, I should not try to borrow from the future to ride out this storm. And this is where we think that this insurance in the family is really important. That usually, because you have more flexibility to do this jointly, that you can react in a more flexible way. And right now, you don't have that same flexibility. So certainly inside the crisis, we do expect amplification of that. Now, if the kids go back to school, in principle, you can work again, but I think important to recognize that childcare isn't just school. It's also grandparents, it's nannies. There's a bunch of other stuff that goes on too, and that also I think will be affected in a persistent way by the crisis. Now, do I really want to have a bunch of babysitters come into my house in October? I don't know. Without a vaccine, it's not obvious. So you think that even after schools go back, that some of these effects will keep on going, will maybe induce more households to have only one earner or one part-time earner. And then for the same reason, that would affect demand too. Participation, I think, is an interesting question. Maybe I leave. Maybe Michelle, you have an idea what the effects might be.
I guess I'm not 100% sure what you meant with the second part. Sorry.
So what the impact was, I think you were asking, right,
Yeah.
on participating in the first place. Whether,
right. Just because we have like 40% of adult population in the United States doesn't work. Like they're not in the labor force, they're not seeking work. And because we are in a very, very severe recession that's done, I mean, you talked about destruction of jobs, like that's so spot on. Like we're already getting data of like firm formation is just like falling off a cliff. So what, like in part of that household bargaining, what does it look like in terms of women entering the labor force, like going and finding more income. Like a household can't save enough. So I'm just wondering, like in it, this is like outside of what you're doing, but like is your model such that when, like Matthias said, you run more of the demand recession through, like will we learn something about that adjustment margin? That was all the question, but so it's kind of, yeah, and you can punt on it too.
So what we know from normal recessions is that it does happen. Women are entering when men lose their jobs to make up for that. And I think it's expected that that channel will also continue to operate, and we allow for it in the model. I still think it is a little bit more muted than in normal recessions for the reason that Matthias just mentioned. That the childcare situation just remains, I think even beyond, as Matthias said, schools opening remains to be an issue because of the extra, things you need. Maybe you don't want a cleaner also to enter your house. It's just many more home tasks to be done. And so, yeah, in the end, it's a quantitative question, of course, and we need more data. And for that, we need to wait, I guess.
Yeah. No, good. Thank you. That's really helpful.
It's many channels. I mean, one interesting observation is that if you think more longer term, right, that the US used to be kind of a world leader in female participation for a long time, but now they've actually fallen back quite a bit, compared to many European countries, and perhaps indicative of the fact that, there's more childcare, there's more parental leave, there's a bit more support for combining work with families in many, not all, but in a good number of European countries. And so that some of the institutional features have really held back female labor supply. It's quite stunning, that from the beginning of the 90s, there's really very flat supply and this trend hasn't continued. And so I think you also have to ask, is this crisis going to maybe relieve some of these constraints? Maybe not right away, but well, there's perhaps some possibility of that happening in the recovery.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the floor. So let's start with Paranta Bazu. You are allowed to speak. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very, very interesting paper, and I really learned quite a bit about the data. So model part's quite elegant. I still have to look at the paper. But I'm just wondering whether I've missed anything here. Do you have any data or stylized facts about this, the role of inequality in the participation of women during the COVID period? Like whether particularly, I'm interested in also knowing the racial profile, like what the African Americans are doing in terms of labor force participation versus, do you have any kind of data for this, or did I miss that, or yes. What are you asking? You are talking about heterogeneity, but I didn't see much about income or wealth inequality.
It's a very good point. So we didn't talk about it, and we actually haven't looked at that yet. I think it might be something important to look at, because there's other studies that show that, and these other studies do show that everything we've talked about does correlate a lot with income also. For example, if you look at the ability to telecommute, which is now really crucial for being able to work, people with higher earnings and higher education have a much higher ability on average to telecommute than those with lower earnings. And so everything we have talked about based on this other data is likely to be more severe for those who have lower incomes and less education to begin with. And so maybe that's something we should consider, putting that dimension in there too. Now, of course, we have lots of things going on already, but I do agree with you. It's based on the data we have seen, it's quite likely to be an important additional dimension.
And since you asked about racial inequality, so again, it's not explicitly in the model, but African Americans are more likely to be poor. I mean, there's a lot of data on that, obviously, but there are also many more single moms among the African Americans. So it definitely does interact with the features that we do have in the model.
I'm not sure how it is in the model, though. So
in the model, there's you heterogeneous by by human capital, but there's no types, so there's no education types or permanent characteristic that would determine your income, so that they're all just state variables that evolve. And so, yeah, one could consider putting it in. And I think Michelle is right, in fact, that the distribution of family types is maybe the very first thing you'd want to look at if you want to.
So you don't have any assumption of the initial distribution of income or wealth in your model, right? Do you consider that, or I didn't quite get that?
So yeah, exactly, because right now it's a model with an infinite horizon. So essentially we look at the station distribution of this model. We are considering turning it into life cycle, with people living and dying over time, which is more realistic, and that would allow us to put more heterogeneity in there in the beginning. So it makes it a bit more complicated, but I think that's a useful direction to take.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So Jeline, you're permitted to speak. Can you ask a question?
It's a very good talk, but I have a question on the long-run effect of this heterogeneity in the household composition, which is, well, I would think of the long-run impact of the heterogeneity through externalities. What I mean is that, well, households now we see them may switching from putting their kids to the schools to childcare at home. But doing so may create an externality which changes, well, there's a change of the culture and a change of the taste, which may lead into the long run a reduction in external childcare services. And also we see people work from home, and maybe it will in the long run cause, well, a shift in the industry, which is the contact intensive industry, and that it may create a permanent change in the structure of the occupation. So what do you think about that that channel?
So we haven't, I didn't spend much time talking about that. No, we do have that social norm in there that evolves as a function of the participation in childcare of women versus men. So that's one long-run aspect. The availability of childcare we have not talked about. It's actually not something we have modeled. It's in fact something interesting to consider. So how actually feasible is it to get childcare in the market for your child? It doesn't show up here. I think it might be important in real life. It varies a lot across countries. There is, I've read certainly some articles that suggest that it's not so obvious that once the school closures come to an end, in fact, everything will open up again, because the schools will open, those are mostly public. But daycare in the United States, at least, is mostly a private sector, and many of those are very small, very fragile businesses that may not survive. So it's not so clear that when we open up maybe in September, that all the daycare is still going to be there. And so that's I think another potential source of persistence that we haven't put into the model yet. And I think we have to wait a bit to learn more about that aspect to see if that's potentially a second source of persistence here.
Okay. Thank you, Jeline. So as we wait for other questions from the audience, Morten had a question. Morten?
Yeah, no, great paper, very interesting. And I guess it's always tempting to ask for more in the model. But I was thinking about whether you think it would be relevant also to consider how the shock is sort of impacting on family dynamics in particular. Maybe some couples are spending a lot of time together. This could be good or bad. And I guess and also there's sort of there's a recession coming. So whether you would expect things to happen with divorce rates and stuff like that.
Yeah, so there's already a lot of evidence that domestic violence, for example, is on the rise. So that is clearly happening, but I think that's outside the scope of our model. So we wanted to really focus on the labor market. But I think there are very interesting other aspects of families. And yeah, domestic violence is one aspect and divorce another, but also we might see a baby boom afterwards. Let's see.
Yes, I'm also, it's definitely, I think that domestic violence is a huge concern. So that's I agree that that's something that maybe not even, it's almost a bit different from what we're talking about here, but it's important to consider. But then divorce is something, just to add to that, another one is also formation of new families. So dating is now impossible. So are these guys going to somehow decide to marry their current girlfriend or boyfriend because search has stopped and so the outside option has gone down? Or maybe are we going to have a whole cohort that delays marriage because it was very difficult to go to the restaurant? So those are interesting questions, and I think they're going to have implications. It's just we don't really have, on some questions we have strong intuitions. Here I'm not so sure. So I think we'll have to wait.
No, but I mean, sort of more seriously, like, I mean, those effects on sort of labor supply going forward could be important, I guess, as important as social norms, no?
Right, I agree. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I actually have, we have a little bit more time. So I have a question actually on the telecommuting versus childcare. If I understand correctly in your model, so if you can telecommute, you can, do your childcare at home. But if you do your childcare at home while you're also telecommuting, in principle, that should reduce your productivity and on your market part of the work. So that could act as a sort of supply side disruptions that, yes, some people can do their childcare at home while they telecommute. So how big of an effect is that in your model? Because anecdotally, that seems to be something, that people are talking about a lot. And then just in general, and this could be a little bit speculative, and your model is mainly about the extensive margin, but not the intensive margin. But something that's being reported a lot is that many people who are indeed telecommuting are essentially working longer hours. And since you're also, concerned about welfare, if you think about, the extra childcare and homeschooling time, and maybe for some occupations, extra actually work hours, these welfare effects could also be meaningful, particularly if they don't then correspond to higher earnings in any way. It's just that, people are working longer, perhaps because it's less efficient to work from home in some way. So I just wonder, what your thoughts are on that, and if it's possible to think about it in the context of the model, or more in general, what kind of evidence we would need to see.
So actually we had discussions on exactly this among the co-authors. So the current formulation says that for each hour of work, you get some fraction of childcare time for free. But of course, you could also think about the other way around, which is for each fraction of childcare time, you get some work done. And I think that formulation, which, we could easily flip it, but we chose the other one for now. But I think that would exactly capture what you were describing, because then, if I'm working with my 3-year-old daughter on my lap, really, I need to work twice as long, or, 50% longer to get the same amount of research done. So that's something I think we'll definitely consider as well.
Okay. Thank you. Matthias, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's not so obvious which is the most important direction of doing it, and we have to at some point make a decision. I think even more, there is the possibility that you can work a given number of hours, but maybe the quality of work you can do is not the same. It's possible to grade papers, something like that. To really do deep work while kids are running around is not the same. There's in the journal literature on the gender gap, right? There's some discussion whether having childcare just doesn't give you the same possibility for kind of the very top level career positions, because those really require this total focus. So is there maybe some cost from combining childcare and working for, say, your accumulation of human capital? So I think that's an interesting question. Probably hard to quantify, but I think it's something worthwhile looking into.
Okay, thank you. So we have one, it's going to be the last question from the floor from Ning Zhang. Ning, you can speak, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for the presentation. I really like it. I have one question. So if you use a model to evaluate the welfare, but an important feature of this
I think you muted yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, you were saying look at the welfare, and then you broke off.
Oh yeah. So I'm thinking about if you use a model to evaluate the welfare, but an important feature of this recession is infection. So for example, people in working in critical job may more likely to get infected, or also you mentioned that in some of your the experiments, like reopening the schools, so that may increase the risk of being infected. So if the model meets this fact about the feature of this infection, so how do we think about the welfare?
Yes, I guess our model is not a model, as Matthias said.
One second, can you guys repeat the question? I think at least we panelists couldn't.
Okay.
Some of us couldn't hear it. So
I could hear,
Oh.
but Ning, why don't you very quickly repeat the question because some people couldn't hear.
Yeah, sure. So my question, if we think use a model to evaluate the welfare, but we miss the aspect of the infection of this recession, then how do we think about the welfare?
Yeah, so as Matthias said at the very beginning of the talk, this is a model about the labor market effects and the macroeconomic repercussions, not the disease itself, which is obviously very important as well in reality. So, but I think if you're talking about the gender dimension there, I think there are two aspects. Men seem to be dying in larger numbers, but the women through their care work seem to be exposed more. So I guess to add all of that and evaluate welfare, I think that's sort of a separate paper. But I guess the one thing to be noted here is so far, at least, it's still only a tiny fraction of the population that is infected. And we hope if containment works, then it will remain a small fraction, versus the labor market effect is affecting essentially everyone or a large fraction, the whole economy.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are no more questions. So I think this is a great time to wrap it up. I want to thank Michelle, Matthias, Jane, and Tita for the great paper and great presentation, and the audience for questions and for attending. So the next VMACS talk is going to be next Tuesday at the usual time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.